The thermometer outside John Davis's cabin window read 37 degrees below zero, and it was still dropping. In the 7 years he has lived in this remote corner of Canada, he has never seen the temperature drop so low. The approaching storm system wasn't just another winter challenge. He was the type that made even the most hardened nature dwellers question their choices. Deep in the heart of the Canadian wilderness, where the nearest town was a 3-hour drive away, his cabin stood high above. A perfect spot with a good view, now covered in heavy snow. The wooden structure, worn down by countless storms, had been his home since he decided to leave his busy life as a writer in New Jersey. Tonight, as the wind howled through the tall pines covered in thick snow, the decision to live here would be a challenge like never before. The March morning began like any other. John woke to the familiar sound of wood burning in his fireplace. The heat from the embers warming well reaching the corners of his modest living room. Through his ice-covered windows, he could see that snow had fallen heavily overnight, adding another thick layer to the drifts. At 43, John has developed a careful routine that has kept him alive in these harsh conditions. Each morning he began with checking his weather radio, assessing his supplies, and maintaining his essential equipment. His hut, though simple, was well stocked with preserved food, medical supplies, and emergency equipment. The walls were lined with photographs he had taken over the years. Images of wolves, moose, and bears in their natural habitat served as silent companions in his solitude. That morning's weather report was particularly worrying. The storm system moving in from the north promised to bring temperatures to record lows and winds strong enough to snap trees. John knew from experience that this was the kind of condition that could trap someone indoors for days, maybe even weeks. He spent the morning securing his generator and checking his backup heating system. Routine was second nature to him now, but he never allowed himself to be careless. In nature, a small mistake can be fatal. His father's old saying ran through his mind, "Nature forgives no carelessness, son." Those words had kept him alive more times than he could count. The afternoon brought the first wave of the storm. Snow fell in thick sheets, reducing visibility to mere feet beyond her balcony. John put more wood in his fireplace and began his usual storm preparations. He filled several large containers with water, knowing that his pipes could freeze despite the heat tape he had carefully wrapped around them. He moved additional firewood inside and checked his emergency flashlights. Living alone in such extreme conditions had changed John in ways he hadn't expected. The constant awareness of the power of nature had made him more patient, more observant. He had learned to read the subtle signs in his environment, the way birds went silent before a storm, the change in air pressure that made his ears pop slightly, the particular quality of stillness that preceded dangerous weather. His satellite phone, his only reliable connection to the outside world, was charged and ready on his desk next to his emergency radio. The nearest ranger station was 70 kilometers away, and in weather like this, help would be impossible for days if something went wrong. John had learned to live with this isolation, finding peace in moments of silence and strength in self-sufficiency. As night approached, the storm intensified. The wind blows through every small opening in the cabin's walls, creating an eerie whistling sound that John had never gotten used to. He prepared a simple dinner of canned soup and bread, keeping his supplies fresh for what could be a long period indoors. What would happen next would challenge everything he knew about surviving in the wild. As night approached, John would face a decision that would test not only his survival skills, but the very core of his humanity. The first sign that something was different came just after midnight. Through the howling wind, John heard a sound that made him sit up straight in his chair, a deep rumble, barely audible over the storm. To someone who had spent years writing for a newspaper, the sound sounded like a bear, and it was close. From his cabin. In the harsh winter, bears should be in deep hibernation. The fact that one was active under these conditions meant something was terribly wrong. John grabbed his flashlight and cautiously approached his window. The beam cut through the swirling snow, but visibility was still poor. The temperature gauge now read 40 below zero, and the wind chill made it seem even colder. Then he saw them. 3 dark shapes moved across the white, their forms barely visible against the snow. A mother bear and 2 cubs, their movements slow and labored. Even from inside, John could see that they were struggling. The mother bear's usual powerful stride had been reduced to an exhausted shuffle, and the cubs huddled close to her, struggling against the brutal wind. What he saw worried him deeply, realizing that this did not appear to be normal behavior. The mother bear was desperate. No animal would willingly expose its cubs to such conditions unless they had no choice. Something must have disturbed their den, forcing them out into this deadly weather. The bears moved closer to their cabin, seeking shelter from the relentless wind. In the beam of his flashlight, John could see ice forming on their fur. The cubs were shivering violently, their small bodies not built to withstand such extreme cold. The mother bear's movements became increasingly unsteady, her strength visibly failing. John's heart raced as the bears approached his porch. This was exactly the kind of situation every wilderness safety guide warned against. Bears near human structures were dangerous under normal circumstances, but these circumstances were far from normal. The desperate mother bear would try anything to protect her cubs from the cold. Through the window, John could now see the bears clearly. The cubs were much smaller than they should have been, probably born late in the season. Their chances of survival in these conditions were slim. The mother bear began to scratch at the snow near his porch, trying to create some form of shelter, but the wind swept away any progress she made. The temperature continued to drop. John's thermometer now refused to give a reading, the liquid inside frozen solid. The wind picked up, and he could see the mother bear trying to shield her cubs with her body, but it was a losing battle. One of the cubs stumbled, falling into the deep snow. The mother bear gently pushed it back up, but John could see the cub's movements becoming slower, more uncoordinated. Time was running out. The bears had been fighting for nearly an hour now, and their condition was deteriorating rapidly. The second cub collapsed, and this time, getting up took longer. The mother bear's attempts to help grew weaker, her own strength fading. She let out another low moan, a sound filled with despair that cut through the howling wind and straight to John's core. John found himself pressed against the window, his breath fogging the glass. He had watched dozens of bears over the summer, written countless articles about their behavior, their struggles, and their triumphs, but he had never seen anything like this. The cold was killing them, slowly but surely, right before his eyes. The bears were now huddled directly against his porch, their last attempt at shelter from the wind. The cubs were barely moving, and the mother bear's eyes were glazed over, the cold overwhelming even her massive body. In the beam of his flashlight, John could see her shivering becoming less frequent, a dangerous sign of hypothermia. John's hand rested on the doorknob of his cabin. Everything he knew about wilderness safety, all the rules he had followed for years, told him to stay inside. But as he watched the bear family slowly die on his porch, another voice inside him grew louder, a voice that asked what value the rules of survival were when compared to dying creatures who needed help. The bears weren't moving much anymore. The cubs were huddled against their mother, who stood between them and the wind. Her eyes met John's through the window, and in that moment, he saw something that shook him to his core. There was no aggression in that look, no wild fury, only exhaustion, despair, and something that looked eerily like resignation. Time seemed to freeze along with the world outside as John stood with his hand on the doorknob. Every survival instinct screamed at him to stay inside. He had seen what desperate bears could do, had seen their power and ferocity. The mother bear, even in her weakened state, could kill him with a single blow if she perceived him as a threat to her cubs. The wind shook their cabin violently, and the bears stopped shivering. John knew enough about hypothermia to understand what that meant. The cubs were going in, the stakes were enormous. If the mother bear panicked, she could destroy their cabin, leaving everyone freezing in the storm. If she attacked him, help wouldn't arrive in time. Even if they survived the night, having 3 bears so close to their living space could prove fatal in other ways. For years, he had documented wildlife without interfering, believing that nature should take its course without human intervention, but as he watched the cubs grow motionless, their small forms barely visible beneath the growing layer of snow, he questioned everything he thought he knew about the relationship between humans and wildlife. The mother bear's eyes never left him. There was something in that look he had never seen before in all his years living in this place. It was as if she understood that he represented her last chance at survival. Her usual wariness of humans seemed to have been overtaken by maternal desperation. Another sharp crack echoed through the night as a twig snapped under the weight of the ice and snow. The sound made John jump, but the bears barely responded. Their lethargy was reaching a critical point. The mother bear tried to pet one of her cubs, but her movements were becoming uncoordinated. Soon, she would be too weak to move. John began to remove his heavy winter coat. If he was going to do this, he would need to be able to move quickly. Another sharp crack echoed through the night as a twig snapped under the weight of the ice and snow. The sound made John jump, but the bears barely responded. Their lethargy was reaching a critical point. The mother bear tried to pet one of her cubs, but her movements were becoming uncoordinated. Soon, she would be too weak to move. John began to remove his heavy winter coat. If he was going to do this, he would need to be able to move quickly. He pulled on his thickest gloves and grabbed several heavy blankets from his emergency supplies. His hand shook as he checked his satellite phone one last time, knowing that in these conditions, it would be useless if things went wrong. The consequences of his next action would be irreversible. Opening that door would break every rule of wilderness safety he lived by. It went against his training, his experience, and his basic common sense. But as he watched another shaky breath leave the mother bear's body, he realized that sometimes survival required more than just following the rules. He thought of his father's words again. Nature does not forgive carelessness. But was it careless to try to save a dying family? Was it reckless to risk everything to prevent the deaths of 3 magnificent creatures? The line between wisdom and folly had never seemed so thin. The cubs had stopped moving completely now. Only the slight rise and fall of their chests showed that they were alive. The mother bear's eyes were beginning to close, her massive body slowly sinking into the snow. The cold was winning its battle even against her incredible strength. In a few more minutes, it would be too late to do anything. John took a deep breath and began his final preparations. He turned on all the heating units, creating as much warmth as possible in the warehouse. He positioned the blankets near the door, where he could reach them quickly. His hands moved steadily now, purpose replacing uncertainty. The mother bear watched his movements through the window, her gaze following him as he worked. There was an intelligence in those eyes that spoke of understanding, of awareness that transcended the usual barriers between humans and wild animals. In that moment, John saw not a dangerous predator, but a mother fighting with her last breath to protect her cubs. The wind howled louder, and the temperature continued its relentless descent. John's watch read just after 2 in the morning, the darkest hour of the night, when the cold was at its most brutal. Everything he knew about bears, about survival, about the proper way to handle encounters with wild animals was about to be put to the test. His hand returned to the doorknob. Through the frosted glass, he could see the 3 bears, their forms growing fainter beneath the falling snow. The next few moments would either be his bravest or his last decision. John took a deep breath and turned the knob. The door swung open with a creak that seemed deafening in the frozen night. The wind immediately rushed in, bringing with it a gust of snow and biting cold that stung his face. The bears were only a few feet away, their bodies now half buried in the growing snowdrifts. Moving slowly, deliberately, John stepped onto his porch. The mother bear's eyes flickered, registering his presence, but she made no aggressive move. Her survival instincts seemed to be at war with her exhaustion. She lifted her head slightly, her nostrils flaring at the scent of him, but even that small movement seemed to drain her remaining energy. Speaking in low, soothing tones, John began to make his way from the porch to the storage room door. Each movement was measured, non-threatening. "It's okay," he found himself whispering, though he knew the bears couldn't understand his words. The mother bear watched him, her eyes showing more awareness now. Thick wool covered their small bodies, and for a terrifying moment, the mother bear tensed. John held his breath, knowing his life depended on her next reaction. But instead of attacking, she slowly and painfully began to sniff the blanket around her cubs, seeming to understand his purpose. Emboldened, John spread another blanket closer to the shed door, creating a path of warmth. His fingers were beginning to go numb, and he knew he couldn't stay out much longer. Everything would depend on the mother bear's next decision. She tried to stand, her legs shaking with the effort. The cubs remained still under the blanket. With gentle movements that belied her size, she tried to nudge one of the cubs. It didn't respond. The second cub was equally still, a sound of anguish rumbling from its throat. A mother's fear for her children cutting through the howling wind. John made his final move. He took a step back, keeping his movement slow and deliberate until he was near the shed door. The warm air that billowed out created a beacon in the darkness, a promise of survival. He waited, his heart thundering in his chest as the mother bear faced her own decision. The huge creature gathered her remaining strength. With agonizing slowness, she managed to stand. For a moment that seemed to stretch for eternity, she stood swaying in the wild wind, her gaze moving between her cubs in the open doorway. Then, with infinite gentleness, she gripped the blanket covering her cubs with her teeth. John watched in awe as the mother bear, fighting exhaustion with every step, began dragging her cubs toward the shed door. The blanket helped them glide over the snow, but each movement clearly took a toll on her precious energy. Her powerful muscles trembled with the effort, but her maternal instincts drove her forward. The distance was only a few feet, but it felt like miles. John stood perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe as the bear family moved closer to safety. The wind grew stronger, nearly knocking him off his feet, but the mother bear kept going, refusing to let go of the blanket that held her precious cargo. Finally, incredibly, they reached the door. The mother bear stopped, her massive frame blocking the entrance, steam rising from her fur as the warm air hit it. This was the moment of greatest danger. If she were to panic now, in such close quarters, there would be no escape. But the bitter cold and the desperate need of her cubs overcame her natural fear. With the last of her strength, she pulled her cubs over the threshold and into the warm room. John watched as the massive creature collapsed beside her children, her body curling protectively around them as the warmth began to seep back into their frozen bodies. With infinite care, John closed the door to the storage room, his movements slow and deliberate. Through the small window in the door, he could see the bear family huddled together in the warm space. The mother bear's eyes remained open, watching him, but the desperate tension in her body began to ease as the warmth seeped through her frozen fur. For the next few hours, John kept vigil from his cabin, watching through the connecting window between his living space and the warehouse. The storm outside reached its peak, shaking the walls of his cabin with unprecedented fury. But inside the warehouse, a miracle was happening. The cubs were the first to show signs of recovery. As their small bodies warmed, they began to stir. Their movements were weak at first, barely noticeable, but gradually grew stronger. The mother bear, despite her own exhaustion, tenderly stroked each cub, encouraging them back to life. She never took her eyes off the window where John watched, but the look in her eyes had changed from desperate resignation to something that seemed almost trusting. By dawn, the cubs were awake and moving, their natural curiosity returning as they explored their temporary shelter. They stayed close to their mother, but their movements became more playful with each passing hour. The mother bear remained alert but calm, seeming to understand that this strange situation was her salvation. The storm lasted for 2 more days. During this time, John carefully placed food and water near the door of the den when the bears were sleeping. The mother bear accepted these offerings, her initial wariness giving way to a cautious acceptance of his presence. He noticed how she waited until he was gone before eating or drinking, maintaining a delicate balance between need and wild instinct. On the morning of the 3rd day, the storm finally broke. The world outside had been transformed into a pristine landscape of snow and ice, but the temperature was beginning to rise. The sun broke through the clouds for the first time in days, bringing with it the promise of survival. John knew it was time. The bears needed to return to the wild before they became too accustomed to human presence. As if sensing this, the mother bear grew restless, her natural instincts calling her back to the forest. The now fully recovered cubs were becoming more active, testing their renewed strength. With the same careful movements he had used that desperate night, John opened the outer door of the shed. Fresh air and sunlight streamed in, and the mother bear lifted her head, smelling the changed weather. She stood, magnificent and powerful once more. So different from the desperate creature she had been 3 nights ago. The cubs followed their mother's lead, their small bodies now moving with the energy of healthy young bears. At the door, the mother bear stopped. She turned her head to John, who stood a respectful distance away. Their eyes met one last time, and in that moment, John felt he understood something profound about the connection between all living things. Then, with surprising grace for such a large animal, she led her cubs out into the snow. John watched as they walked into the forest, their dark forms dwarfed by the white landscape. The cubs bounded through the snow, their near-death experience forgotten in the young animal's wake. Their mother followed more slowly, her powerful form silhouetted against the rising sun. Just before they disappeared into the trees, the mother bear stopped and looked back one last time. She stood there for a long moment, her presence commanding even from a distance. Then she turned and disappeared into the forest with her cubs, leaving only tracks in the snow as evidence of their extraordinary encounter. John stood at his window long after they had gone, reflecting on the experience. He had broken every rule of safety in the wild, risking his life for an instinct he could not fully explain. Yet as he watched the sun rise over the transformed landscape, he knew he would make the same choice again. In the years that followed, he would sometimes see bears in the distance and wonder if they were the same family he had sheltered that desperate night. But he never tried to approach them. Some of the memories he learned remained in his heart. His decision to open that door taught him that sometimes survival meant more than just staying alive. Sometimes it meant remembering our shared connection with all living things, even in the most difficult circumstances. If this incredible story of compassion and survival touched your heart, be sure not to miss more incredible wildlife encounters and tales of human kindness. Subscribe to our channel now by clicking the button below and join our community of nature enthusiasts. Turn on notifications to be alerted to new stories that showcase the extraordinary connections between humans and wildlife. We bring you heartwarming tales every week. Remember, your subscription helps us continue to share these remarkable stories.